The bodies were still frozen when spring finally came to the Greenland settlement. 37 Vikings dead in 9 longhouses, their corpses stiff beneath collapsed roofs and shattered timber. The great hall of Jarl Eirik had fallen first, 60 feet of prestigious construction crushed under 15 feet of snow, killing the chieftain, his wife, his 3 sons, and 8 of his most loyal warriors. The other longhouses had followed in the days after, one by one, as the worst storm in living memory buried the eastern settlement beneath a white grave. The rescue party from the western settlement found them in April 1124, when the passes finally cleared enough for travel. They expected to find everyone dead. No one could survive a storm that had dropped 20 feet of snow in 3 weeks, that had brought temperatures so cold the sea ice extended 50 miles from shore, that had lasted from early January until late February with barely a break. They didn't expect to find Bjorn Grimson cooking fish over a peat fire, warm and well-fed, emerging from what looked like a grass-covered mound rising barely 4 feet above the snow line. "You're alive," the rescue party leader said stupidly. "Obviously," Bjorn replied. "Why wouldn't I be?" Behind him, the mound breathed thin smoke from a hole in its center. The entrance was a low tunnel, half buried in drifted snow, requiring a man to crawl on hands and knees to enter. The structure looked nothing like a proper Viking longhouse. It looked like a burial mound, or perhaps a hill that someone had hollowed out for storage. "What is that?" one of the rescuers asked. "My house has been my house for 11 winters now." "That's not a house, that's a hole, a turf pile. That turf pile is 70 degrees inside right now." How warm were the longhouses when everyone froze? No one had an answer. The longhouses had been cold, everyone knew that. The great halls were drafty, required enormous fires to heat, and lost warmth the moment the flames died. But they were proper Viking construction, the kind of building that free men built, the kind of structure that showed status and wealth. Bjorn's turf house showed nothing except survival, and while 37 people had frozen to death in prestigious longhouses, Bjorn Grimson had spent the winter alone in his grass-covered mound, warm enough to remove his tunic, eating stored food, sleeping comfortably through nights that killed everyone within 20 miles. Bjorn Grimson had arrived in Greenland in 1109 as a young man of 23, part of a group of settlers from Iceland seeking new land and opportunity. He'd been poor, too poor to afford passage on the better ships, too poor to bring livestock or supplies, too poor to claim good land near the established settlements. He'd been given a marginal plot 5 miles from the eastern settlement, rocky ground near the glacier's edge that no one else wanted. The other settlers had built longhouses in the traditional Norse style, timber frames where timber was available, stone foundations, walls of stacked turf blocks, and wooden roofs covered with sod. These structures were long and narrow, some 60 or 70 feet long, but only 15 feet wide, with a central hearth running the length of the building. They were designed to house extended families, livestock, and servants all under one roof, reflecting the social structure and status of their owners. Bjorn couldn't afford a longhouse. He had no timber for framing, no tools for stone cutting, no family to house, no livestock to shelter. He had only himself, a knife, a small axe, and knowledge he'd learned from an old Icelandic farmer who'd spent years in the far north trading with the Skraelings, the native peoples who'd lived in the Arctic for thousands of years. The Skraelings didn't build longhouses, they built small, low, circular or oval structures half buried in the earth, with walls of stacked stones and turf, roofs of driftwood and whalebone covered with thick layers of sod, and entrances that required crawling through tunnels. These structures looked primitive to Norse eyes, but they had one advantage that the old Icelandic trader had noticed. They stayed warm with almost no fuel, while longhouses required constant fires that consumed entire forests. Bjorn decided to build like the Skraelings rather than like his fellow Vikings. The reaction from the settlement was immediate and hostile. Building a proper longhouse was a matter of honor. A man's home reflected his status, his ambition, his worthiness as a member of the community. A man who built like a Skraeling was barely a man at all. He was admitting defeat, accepting poverty, rejecting the ways of his ancestors. Jarl Eirik summoned Bjorn to his great hall to discuss the matter. "I'm told you're building a scraling hole instead of a proper house," the chieftain said. "I'm building what I can afford and what will keep me alive, Jarl. A longhouse keeps men alive. That's why we build them. A longhouse requires timber I don't have, labor I can't hire, and fuel I can't gather. The turf house requires only what the land provides. You'll freeze in that hole? I'll freeze in a longhouse I can't heat. The turf house needs almost no heating. The earth itself keeps it warm." Jarl Eirik shook his head. "You're a fool, Grimson, building like a savage instead of a Norseman. Don't expect help from this settlement when your savage hut fails." "I don't expect help, Jarl. I expect to survive." Bjorn was dismissed with contempt. He returned to his land and continued building his fool's house, ignoring the mockery that followed him through the settlement. The other Vikings called it Bjorn's Barrow, a burial mound for a man who was already dead to proper society. Bjorn's turf house was designed according to principles he'd learned from the old Icelandic trader who'd spent 3 winters living among the Thule people of the far north. The construction was specific and deliberate, nothing like the haphazard pile it appeared to be. The excavation, Bjorn started by digging into a south-facing hillside, creating a pit approximately 12 feet wide, 15 feet long, and 4 feet deep. This excavation served multiple purposes. It placed the floor below ground level where earth temperature was stable, it provided material for the walls and roof, and it reduced the amount of structure that needed to be built above ground. The foundation. Around the perimeter of the excavation, Bjorn stacked flat stones to create a low wall about 2 feet high. These stones served as a foundation that would prevent the turf walls from direct contact with ground moisture, reducing rot and improving longevity. The walls. On top of the stone foundation, Bjorn stacked turf blocks, thick rectangles of soil held together by grass roots, each about 18 inches long, 12 inches wide, and 6 inches thick. He cut these blocks from the meadow near his site, selecting areas with dense grass that would bind the soil together. The wall construction was specific. Bjorn stacked the turf in alternating patterns, like brickwork, with each layer overlapping the joints below. He built the walls with a slight inward lean, so they'd be self-supporting and wouldn't require a heavy timber frame. The walls rose about 3 feet above ground level, making the total wall height 7 feet from the excavated floor. The roof. Here was where Bjorn's design diverged most dramatically from traditional longhouse construction. Instead of a peaked timber roof, he built a domed roof of driftwood, whalebone, and willow branches bent into arches. This framework was then covered with layers of birch bark for waterproofing, turf blocks, and finally a thick layer of sod that would grow grass in spring. The roof was low. The highest point was only about 5 feet above the floor, requiring occupants to stoop. But this low profile meant less surface area exposed to wind, less interior volume to heat, and more stability under snow load. The dome shape distributed weight evenly, making collapse virtually impossible. The entrance. Instead of a door in the wall, Bjorn built an entrance tunnel that extended about 8 feet from the main chamber. The tunnel entrance was at ground level outside, but the tunnel floor dropped about 2 feet as it progressed inward, then rose again to enter the main chamber. This S-curve created a cold trap. Dense cold air would settle in the low point of the tunnel rather than flowing into the living space. The tunnel was just large enough to crawl through on hands and knees. A wooden frame at the outer end could be blocked with a turf plug in extreme weather, completely sealing the structure. The hearth. In the center of the floor, Bjorn built a small stone hearth, about 2 feet square. Above it, he left a small smoke hole in the roof, perhaps 8 inches across, that could be partially covered, with a stone slab to regulate draft. The hearth was designed for tiny fires of dried peat, driftwood, or animal dung, nothing like the roaring flames of longhouse central fires. The interior. Along the walls, Bjorn built raised sleeping platforms of stone and turf, covered with heather and animal skins. These platforms kept sleepers off the cold floor and positioned them in the warmest air layer near the ceiling. Storage areas were built into the walls themselves, niches carved into the turf. When finished, the structure was barely visible on the landscape. The grass-covered dome looked like a natural hillock. The entrance tunnel was hidden in a fold of terrain. From 100 yards away, you'd never know anyone lived there. The other settlers thought it was pathetic. A hole in the ground, a skraeling hovel, a structure unworthy of a free Norse farmer. Bjorn ignored them and moved into his house in October 1113, 11 years before the storm that would prove everyone wrong. Bjorn's first winter in the turf house taught him that everything the old Icelandic trader had said was true. The structure stayed warm with almost no fuel input. The key was earth temperature. 4 feet below the surface, the ground in Greenland maintained a temperature of approximately 40 to 45 degrees Fahrenheit year-round, cold but vastly warmer than the -20-degree air temperatures of deep winter. Bjorn's floor, walls, and much of his roof were in direct contact with this stable thermal mass. His house started each day at 45 degrees before he lit any fire at all. The thick turf walls and roof provided insulation equivalent to several feet of solid material. Wind couldn't penetrate, cold air couldn't infiltrate. The small interior space, perhaps 180 square feet, required minimal heat to maintain comfortable temperature. With a small peat fire burning for 2 to 3 hours in the evening, Bjorn's interior temperature rose to 65 degrees. The thermal mass of the surrounding earth absorbed this heat and released it slowly through the night. By morning, even with the fire long dead, interior temperature remained above 50 degrees. His fuel consumption was perhaps 1/10 of what the Longhouses required. He burned a small basket of dried peat per day. The Longhouses burned cartloads of wood and peat to achieve inferior results. The Longhouse fires roared constantly but heated only the area immediately around them. The far ends of the halls remained frigid, the sleeping benches along the walls were cold, and the moment fires died, temperature plummeted. After his first winter, Bjorn tried to share his observations with the settlement. He visited Jarl Eirik's great hall in spring 1114 and attempted to explain what he'd learned. My house stayed warm all winter with almost no fire. The earth itself heats it. If you built smaller, buried more in the ground, Jarl Eirik cut him off. You want us to live like skraelings, to crawl into holes like animals? You've been alone too long, Grimson. It's affected your mind. I'm trying to help. The Longhouses are inefficient. They waste fuel, they're cold despite the waste, and they're vulnerable to snow load. Your design is an embarrassment. A free Norseman lives in a hall, not a burrow. We've built Longhouses for generations. We don't need advice from a man who lives like a savage. Bjorn left without convincing anyone. He tried again the following year, and the year after that. Each time, he was dismissed with contempt. His neighbors didn't want to hear that their prestigious halls were inferior to his humble turf mound. The suggestion itself was insulting, so Bjorn stopped trying. He tended his small farm, hunted seal and caribou, traded furs for what few goods he needed, and lived alone in his warm, comfortable, shameful house. If the settlement wanted to freeze in their grand halls, that was their choice. For 11 years, Bjorn lived as an outcast at the edge of the eastern settlement. He attended the required assemblies, paid his tithes to the church, and fulfilled his minimal obligations to the community. But he was never accepted, never respected, never treated as an equal. The contempt wasn't subtle. When Bjorn walked through the settlement, people would mutter hole dweller or skraeling lover. Children threw stones at his back. Women crossed themselves as if he carried bad luck. Men who owed him fair trade goods would delay payment indefinitely, knowing he had no social standing to demand enforcement. Jarl Eirik led the mockery. At feasts, he would tell stories about Bjorn's barrow, comparing it to the graves of thralls and the dens of foxes. He'd speculate about what kind of man would choose to live underground like a worm. The hall would roar with laughter, while Bjorn, if he was present, would sit silently, and eat whatever scraps he was offered. But Bjorn noticed things the others didn't. He noticed that the longhouse fires burned constantly, but never quite warmed the halls. He noticed that people clustered near the central hearths, while the edges of the great buildings remained cold enough to see breath. He noticed that timber was becoming scarce as the settlement consumed its limited driftwood supplies, and that men were traveling farther each year to find fuel. He noticed that his turf house required almost no maintenance, while the longhouse roofs needed constant repair. He noticed that his small smoke hole never clogged with soot, while longhouse roof vents were major sources of heat loss. He noticed that his entrance tunnel kept wind out completely, while longhouse doors let in blasts of frigid air every time someone entered or exited. Most ominously, he noticed the weather changing. Winters were becoming harsher. The sea ice was extending farther. Storms were lasting longer. The warming period that had made Greenland settlement viable in the first place seemed to be ending, replaced by a cooling trend that would eventually make the island uninhabitable. In the old days, longhouses had been adequate. Cold, yes, but survivable. But as temperatures dropped and storms intensified, the margin between adequate and fatal was narrowing. Bjorn could see it coming. The longhouses that had worked for generations were approaching the edge of viability. When he tried to warn people, they laughed at him. The hole dweller thought he knew better than everyone else. Typical arrogance from a man too poor to build properly. The winter of 1123-24 began badly. Heavy snow fell in early December, unusual for that time of year. By Christmas, 3 feet had accumulated, more than usually fell in an entire winter. Temperatures dropped to 30 below zero during the long Arctic nights, cold enough that exposed skin froze in minutes. Bjorn watched the snow accumulating on the longhouse roofs with growing concern. The traditional Norse construction wasn't designed for this kind of load. The peaked roofs shed snow effectively in normal winters, but this wasn't a normal winter. Snow was falling faster than it could slide off, building up layer after layer, pressing down with increasing weight. He visited Jarl Eirik's hall on December 28th to share his concerns. The snow is building on your roof faster than it's falling off. If this continues, my roof has stood for 20 years. It will stand 20 more. The timber is stressed. I can see the ridgepole bowing from outside. If you cleared the snow... Are you telling me how to maintain my hall, Grimson? The hole dweller knows better than a jarl how to build. I'm telling you, the snow load is dangerous. The weight is fine. My builders knew what they were doing, unlike the Skraeling who designed your barrow. Now get out of my hall before I have you thrown out. Bjorn left. He made similar visits to other longhouses over the following days, with similar results. No one wanted advice from the settlement's lowest status resident. His warnings were dismissed as jealousy, as attention-seeking, as the ravings of a man who'd been alone too long in his underground hole. On January 3rd, 1124, the real storm began. The storm that would kill 37 people started with a deceptive calm. January 3rd dawned clear, bitterly cold but windless. Many took the opportunity to hunt, to check livestock, to perform outdoor tasks that had been delayed by the December weather. By mid-afternoon, the sky had changed. Clouds rolled in from the northeast, thick and dark and moving fast. Wind began to rise. By sunset, the first flakes were falling. By midnight, a full blizzard was raging across the eastern settlement. Wind screamed at 70 miles per hour, driving snow horizontally, creating whiteout conditions where visibility dropped to zero. Temperature plummeted to 40 below. Anyone caught outside would be dead within minutes. Inside the longhouses, families huddled around central fires, burning fuel at prodigious rates, trying to push back against cold that penetrated every gap and crack in the timber and turf walls. The great halls groaned under the wind pressure. Smoke from the fires swirled as drafts found their way through roof vents and door frames. In his turf house, Bjorn lit his small evening fire, ate his dinner, and went to sleep. The storm raged above him, but 5 feet of turf and earth muffled the sound to a distant whisper. His entrance tunnel, blocked with a turf plug, admitted no wind at all. Interior temperature was 62 degrees, comfortable enough that he slept under a single fur, rather than the pile of blankets he'd need in a longhouse. He woke occasionally during the night, aware of the storm, but not threatened by it. His house couldn't collapse. There was no roof to collapse in the traditional sense, just a dome of earth that would simply compress further if weight increased. His house couldn't lose heat to wind. The turf walls had no gaps, no cracks, no penetrations except the sealed entrance and the small smoke hole, which was sheltered by a stone baffle. The storm continued through January 4th, 5th, 6th. Snow accumulated at rates that no one had seen before. 2 feet fell on the 4th, 3 feet on the 5th. By January 7th, the total accumulation exceeded 8 feet, and the storm showed no signs of stopping. On January 8th, Jarl Eirik's longhouse collapsed. The ridgepole, stressed beyond its capacity by tons of accumulated snow, cracked at approximately 2 in the morning. The sound was tremendous, a cannon shot of splintering timber, audible even over the storm's roar. The roof fell inward, bringing the walls with it, burying everyone inside under logs, turf, and snow. 12 people died instantly or within minutes, crushed or trapped in the wreckage. Eirik himself survived the initial collapse but was pinned under a roof beam, unable to free himself. He froze to death over the following hours, conscious and aware, watching his breath crystallize in the air, unable to move or escape. His hall had been the strongest in the settlement. If it could fall, any could fall. Over the following 3 weeks, 8 more longhouses collapsed. Some failed from snowload, like Eirik's. Others failed from the structural stress of extreme cold, which caused timber to contract and joints to separate. Others failed when inhabitants, desperate for fuel, began burning structural components, weakening their own buildings to stay warm. 37 dead by the time the storm finally ended in late February. Nearly half the settlement's population, including the Jarl, his family, and most of the leading men. Bjorn survived the entire storm in his turf house. It wasn't easy. The entrance tunnel became completely blocked by snow early in the blizzard, requiring him to spend an hour each day clearing a ventilation path to ensure air circulation. Food supplies ran low toward the end. He'd been prepared for a normal winter, not an 8-week siege. He lost weight, felt weak by the final days, and knew that another month would have pushed him to starvation. But he was never cold. His house maintained temperature between 50 and 65 degrees throughout the storm, depending on whether he'd burned his daily fire. The earth around him held its stable temperature regardless of what happened on the surface. The turf walls and roof provided consistent insulation. The dome shape distributed the snow load, eventually over 15 feet of accumulation without structural stress. When the storm finally broke in late February, Bjorn dug out his entrance tunnel and emerged into a transformed landscape. Snow had buried everything. The settlement's longhouses were invisible mounds, their locations marked only by slight depressions where roofs had collapsed. No smoke rose from any structure. No voices called out. The silence was absolute. Bjorn spent 3 days traveling to each longhouse, digging where he could, checking for survivors. He found none. The cold had killed anyone who survived the initial collapses. Bodies were frozen solid, preserved perfectly in temperatures that had stayed below 0 for 8 weeks. He survived on food scavenged from the ruins, grain stores, frozen meat, preserved fish. The dead didn't need it anymore. He waited alone in the destroyed settlement for 6 weeks until the rescue party from the western settlement finally arrived. When they found him cooking fish over his peat fire, warm and alive, they thought they were seeing a ghost. The rescue party consisted of 15 men from the western settlement, sent to assess damage and assist survivors. They found 1 survivor, Bjorn, and 37 corpses. The party leader, a man named Thorvald Karlsson, demanded a full explanation. How had Bjorn survived when everyone else had died? What made his pathetic turf mound superior to the grand longhouses? Bjorn walked them through everything: the earth temperature stability, the insulation value of thick turf walls, the dome shape that distributed snow load, the entrance tunnel that blocked wind infiltration, the small interior space that required minimal heating, the elimination of air gaps that plagued timber construction. The longhouses fight against winter, Bjorn explained. They try to push cold back with fire, but fire requires fuel, and fuel runs out. They try to keep wind out with walls, but walls have gaps, and wind finds every gap. They try to shed snow with peaked roofs, but roofs can only shed so much before they fail. My house doesn't fight winter. It hides from winter. The earth doesn't know it's cold outside. The earth stays the same temperature always. If you surround yourself with earth, you share that stability. My house is underground, so my house is stable. The storm could last 8 weeks or 8 months. My house doesn't care. It simply continues being what it always is. Thorvald listened carefully. Why didn't you warn people? Why didn't you tell them their houses were dangerous? Bjorn laughed bitterly. I tried. For 11 years I tried. They called me a fool, a savage lover, a hole dweller. Jarl Eirik threw me out of his hall the week before it collapsed. I told him his ridge pole was bowing, told him to clear his roof. He said his builders knew better than a Skraeling. Now he's frozen under that roof. They didn't listen because of pride. They didn't listen because my house was shameful, and theirs were prestigious. A man's house showed his status. My house showed I was poor and low. How could a low man's house be better than a jarl's hall? It was impossible. Therefore it must be false. Therefore I must be a fool. The logic was perfect. Only reality disagreed. Thorvald looked at the turf mound, really looked at it for the first time. It was small, low, almost invisible against the hillside. No one would call it impressive. No one would praise its builder's status, but it had kept a man alive through the worst storm in memory, while 9 prestigious longhouses had collapsed and killed their occupants. Will you teach us to build these? Thorvald asked. I'll teach anyone who wants to learn. The question is whether anyone will actually build them, or whether pride will kill more people before you accept what works. Bjorn spent the spring and summer of 1124 teaching turf house construction to anyone willing to learn. Some were. The deaths had shocked the surviving Greenland Norse, had shattered their confidence in traditional construction. Some were ready to admit that the old ways might not be the only ways. But pride remained a barrier. Even after 37 deaths, some refused to consider Skraeling construction. They would rebuild the longhouses exactly as before, perhaps with stronger ridge poles, but otherwise unchanged. The turf house design was still shameful, still low status, still unworthy of free Norse farmers. The church was particularly resistant. The priests declared that the turf houses resembled pagan burial mounds and might invite evil spirits. They refused to bless any structure built according to Bjorn's design, and they discouraged their parishioners from adopting it. Still, some listened. Over the following decade, approximately 20 turf houses were built in the eastern and western settlements, not as primary residences but as backup shelters, emergency refuges, places to survive when longhouses failed. These Bjorn houses, or fools' houses, saved lives in several subsequent storms, sheltering families whose longhouses became uninhabitable. The design evolved as others adopted it. Some builders made them larger, adding multiple chambers connected by tunnels. Others added storage rooms or livestock areas. Some experimented with different insulation materials or entrance configurations, but the core principles remained: semi-underground construction, thick turf walls, domed roofs, tunnel entrances, modern archaeological Analysis of Viking Greenland settlements confirms the physics that Bjorn understood intuitively: Earth temperature stability. At 4 feet below the surface, ground temperature in southern Greenland remains approximately 42 to 48 degrees Fahrenheit year-round. This stable temperature is warmer than winter air, but cooler than summer air, providing natural climate control. Turf insulation value. Turf, sod, has an R value of approximately R0.5 to R1 per inch. A 2-foot-thick turf wall provides R12 to R24 insulation, comparable to modern construction standards. Combined with the earth berming of semi-underground construction, total insulation values could exceed R40. Thermal mass. The massive earth walls and floor acted as thermal batteries, absorbing heat during warm periods and releasing it during cold periods. This mass damped temperature swings, maintaining more stable interior conditions than lightweight timber frame construction. Dome structure. Dome shapes distribute load evenly in all directions, making them extremely resistant to collapse. Snow accumulation adds weight, but that weight is spread across the entire surface, rather than concentrated at specific points. Archaeological evidence shows that the few turf houses from this period that have been excavated showed no signs of structural failure despite centuries of Arctic weather. Air infiltration. The entrance tunnel design, with its cold trap depression, prevented cold air from flowing into the living space. Tests on reconstructed turf houses show interior air exchange rates far lower than longhouse construction, reducing heat loss from air infiltration. Comparative heat loss. Modern calculations estimate that a typical Viking longhouse lost heat at approximately 50,000 to 100,000 BTUs per hour in severe winter conditions. A comparably sized turf house lost heat at approximately 5,000 to 10,000 BTUs per hour, an order of magnitude better performance. This difference translated directly to fuel consumption and survival margin. The eastern settlement never fully recovered from the 1124 storm. The loss of Jarl Eirik and the other leading men disrupted social organization. The loss of population reduced the labor available for farming, hunting, and trade. The psychological trauma of the disaster lingered for generations. The Norse Greenland colonies ultimately failed in the 15th century, abandoned as climate continued to cool and contact with Europe became increasingly difficult. Multiple factors contributed to the collapse: declining trade, reduced food production, possible conflict with Inuit peoples, and the accumulated effects of the Little Ice Age that made Greenland increasingly marginal for European-style agriculture and settlement. But among the factors, the failure to adapt housing to changing conditions played a role. The Norse clung to longhouse construction even as climate deteriorated, even as evidence accumulated that their traditional designs were inadequate, even as the Inuit peoples around them demonstrated that different approaches worked better. The Inuit survived in Greenland. They're still there today. Their semi-underground turf and stone houses, their efficient use of limited fuel, their designs that worked with the Arctic environment rather than fighting against it. These adaptations allowed them to thrive where the Norse perished. Bjorn Grimson had adopted Inuit techniques a century before the end. He'd been mocked for it, ostracized for it, called a fool and a savage, but he'd survived when proud men froze, and his techniques saved other lives in subsequent emergencies. The lesson was available to anyone willing to learn it. Most weren't willing. Pride was stronger than survival. Status was more important than warmth. The longhouses that killed people remained more prestigious than the turf houses that saved them, and so the Norse Greenland colony faded away, replaced by people who'd never been too proud to build what worked. Bjorn Grimson lived until 1147, dying at approximately 61 years old, an exceptional age for the era and conditions. He spent his final 23 years as something between a pariah and a prophet, still looked down upon by those who valued status but respected by practical people who'd seen his predictions come true and his methods work. He never married, never accumulated wealth, never achieved the social standing that the Norse valued valued so highly. He remained in his turf house until the end, expanding it slightly over the years, improving its comfort, proving that a man could live well in a structure that others called shameful. His funeral was sparsely attended. The church gave him minimal rites, disapproving of his Skraeling-style house to the end. No saga was composed about his life. No stone was raised in his memory. He was buried in an unmarked grave that no one today could locate. But the knowledge he'd tried to share didn't die with him. The turf house techniques he'd taught persisted in some families, passed from generation to generation as emergency knowledge, the kind of thing you might need someday, even if you hoped you never would. When archaeologists began excavating Greenland Norse sites in the 19th and 20th centuries, they found evidence of both building traditions, the longhouses that the Norse were famous for, and the smaller, more efficient turf structures that some had adopted. The turf houses were better preserved, their earthen construction having protected them from decay better than timber. Some showed signs of continuous occupation for centuries. The Fool's House outlasted the halls of Jarls. Everyone mocked Bjorn Grimson's turf house. They called it a barrow, a hole, a Skraeling hovel. They said it was shameful, undignified, unworthy of a free Norseman. They said that building like the native peoples was admitting defeat, accepting low status, rejecting the proud traditions of their ancestors. Then the worst storm in memory hit, and 9 longhouses collapsed, and 37 people froze to death in structures that everyone agreed were proper and prestigious. Bjorn sat in his shameful hole, warm and alive, while Jarl and thrall alike perished in halls that were supposed to be superior. The turf house stayed at 70 degrees because it worked with the earth rather than fighting against it. It used stable ground temperature instead of trying to overwhelm cold air with fire. It insulated completely instead of leaking heat through every gap and crack. It distributed snow load instead of trying to shed it. It required minimal fuel instead of consuming forests to achieve inferior results. It wasn't sophisticated. It wasn't impressive. It wasn't the kind of construction that earned respect or demonstrated status. But it kept a man alive when prestigious construction killed everyone else within 20 miles. Sometimes survival has no dignity. Sometimes the shameful choice is the only choice that works. Sometimes the fool who builds wrong is the only one who lives to be called anything at all. Bjorn Grimson outsmarted winter by abandoning his pride and building what worked instead of what earned respect. The men who mocked him are forgotten, their bones mixed with the rubble of their collapsed halls. But the technique he used survived, and the principle he demonstrated remains true. The best shelter isn't the one that looks impressive, it's the one that keeps you alive when everything else fails. And sometimes the Fool's House is the only house left standing.